Welcome to IVF This, Episode 16, Grieving Losses.
Welcome to IVF This. I'm your host, Emily Ginn. I'm a mother to two beautiful and feral boys. I'm married to my favorite person in the world. I'm a social worker, a life coach, and an IVF warrior. I'm here to teach you how to manage your mind and emotions during your IVF journey, to break free from anxiety and regain control of your life, even in the midst of infertility. I'm going to teach you to say IVF this to how we think about, talk about, and experience infertility. Let's go.
Want to start out with a trigger warning. I want to make sure to put this warning out there at the beginning of this episode. I'm going to be talking a lot about loss and how we grieve. Yes, I realize this is the name of this episode, but because it is a very triggering topic in our community, I wanted to make sure to put the warning out there. If you need to turn this off, that's totally fine. You can come back to it when you're ready, or skip this one entirely. There's no wrong way to do this, love. All right, friends, I hope you are doing so well. It's been a pretty amazing few weeks. I have gotten more and more involved with the new app Clubhouse, and I am all kinds of here for it. I think I talked a little bit about this last week, but it's an audio-only app, and you can kind of think of it as an old-school chat room, except you get to talk back and forth instead of writing back and forth, or you can just hang out and listen. It's totally up to you. But it's an amazing platform, and there are so many infertility and IVF groups, clubs, rooms that are out there. It really is a tremendous opportunity to collaborate and support each other in this amazing community. I'm on Clubhouse. My username is, of course, at IVF This Coaching. You guys know I love to stay on brand. And I host a call on Mondays at 1:15 Central Standard Time. It's an open coaching call. I had my first one this past week, and it was so much fun, guys, really. We covered topics like anxiety, relationships, managing expectations, and so much more. I had a blast. So if you're on there, come find me. Follow me on there. You can click the bell next to my name after you follow me, and that will alert you at any time I'm in any club or hosting a club or anything like that. And there are tons of clubs and stuff to follow. I follow a bunch of people. If you're not on there yet and you're an iPhone user, you can send me a DM on Instagram, and I have a few more invitations. If you're an Android user, just hold out a little bit longer. I know that they're working on starting to do some of the programming to get Clubhouse on Android phones. So hang in there. Another thing I wanted to mention is that I am opening up a few more slots for my one-on-one coaching program in the coming weeks. If you're liking this podcast and you're interested to see what it would be like to work together, there's a couple of options. One way to do it is with a mini session. So that is a 30-minute call that is exclusively for coaching. You come to the call with a thing that you want to coach on, something that you want to work on, something that you've been thinking about, or that's maybe causing some pain for you, and we just dive right in, right? It just gives you an opportunity to be exposed to what it's like coaching, how powerful coaching can be. It really is a tremendous opportunity. My first experience with coaching was in a 30-minute mini session, and it changed my entire life. And the other way is through a consultation. So that is about an hour where you and I want you to think of it as like a strategy session. We're going to go through and we're going to find out the areas where you can be most supported, and we create a plan around that. Now, both options are completely complimentary, and they're a lot of fun. So what do you have to lose, right? If you like the podcast, come chat with me. You can find links for both the mini session and the consultation on my website, www.ivfthiscoaching.com, or the links in my bio are in my Instagram page. Either way, it'll get you to the same place. So come talk with me. I'm cool to hang out with. I bet you'll find that out. Now, let's talk about today's topic, grieving losses. If you're listening to this episode, I'm going to guess that you have experienced a loss. If you're human, I'm going to guess that you have experienced a loss. It is a normal and expected part of being human. There are many losses that we experience during our lives. Now, I'm not really going to touch on how to grieve, like specific steps. I talk about that in episode 7, which is called Feel Better Now. It's a 3-step process that can be used for any emotion, including grief. So today I want to talk about the different types of losses, how many of us experience grief, and then I'm going to share an amazing analogy for how grief changes over time. So during my social work career and education and in working in grief and loss, you kind of learn that there are 5 basic categories of loss. So the first one is necessary loss. These are losses that are replaced by something different or better, like a natural or positive part of life. So think of like kids going off to college and leaving family and friends behind to build new friends and new careers, right? It's an exciting loss, right? You still feel that grief and loss when you go off to college. So that's the first one. That's necessary loss. 2 is actual loss. These are losses when you can no longer touch, hear, see, or have near you the person or object that you love. This is experienced in many different ways, like losing a treasured object, a pet, a job, or a loved one. Many of us have experienced actual loss. Many of us have experienced all of these losses. Like if you're human, you've experienced all of these types of losses. But I want to make sure that we touch on the actual losses because so many of us have experienced actual loss in our life. And that is a lot of the ways that we kind of perceive grief. So the third way is a maturation loss. So this is the loss that we experience going through life with normal developmental processes. So think of like kids going off to college, retirement, maybe a breakup can be a form of maturation loss. It can also be a form of actual loss, really kind of is situationally dependent. Now, the last 2 that we're going to cover, we're going to spend the most time on. One is, or number 4 rather, is situational loss. This is a loss occurring from an unpredictable life event that usually creates many other losses. So death is the most significant one. For most of us, that includes death. And that would encompass miscarriage or stillbirth. That would also include if you have experienced an IVF cycle and maybe you didn't get any day 5 blastocytes, or you had a failed transfer. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But finally, the last form of loss is perceived loss. And this one has always been super interesting to me because I think it's a very unique experience in the world of infertility, because it's a loss that is deeply felt by the individual, but it's often less obvious to others. It's very real to the griever, though. And I think a lot of us, even if you've never gone through IVF or any form of fertility treatments, I think this is so much of what we experience in either primary or secondary infertility. Now, again, within the context of infertility, a situational loss could be no viable embryos after a cycle, a failed transfer, miscarriage, stillborn, or infant loss. All of these things are incredibly traumatic events. They are the very definition of a worst case scenario, and yet they are all too real. These types of losses create a sense of injustice, because it's not just the loss of that M-baby or that baby, it's the loss for the potential and the unfulfilled dreams that you have. I grieved and continue to grieve so hard for the image that I had in mind for that last little boy M-baby. We had a name, we had plans, we had a future, and that was the grief that is so real and at the time was so guttural and visceral. The perceived loss of infertility is not as commonly acknowledged as situational losses. Infertility is best described as a disenfranchised grief, meaning that it's not widely accepted as grief by society. There are no ceremonies associated with infertility or grief rituals that accompany infertility. This type of loss also invokes, again, feelings of injustice and anger. The ease of getting pregnant that we all hear as we're growing up is the expectation that many of us have. I think most of us walk into this trying to conceive phase with that idea and that expectation. The irony of me spending the better part of 15 years trying to not get pregnant, only to be faced with the inability to get pregnant, was rage-inducing. We have a plan for how our lives should go, like the expected course that we all know. You get an education, college, high school, trade school, whatever. You start your career, you meet someone, you fall in love, you get married, maybe you get the White House and the picket fence, and then the baby. It's the expectation that we are grieving, the potential loss of that entire stage of life. For most of society, infertility is invisible. There is so much stigma and shame that is prevalent with infertility that also keeps it invisible. I have a couple of podcast episodes that talk about this. Episode 3 talks about the myths of grief that are all too common in our society and very detrimental. And episode 4, which is specifically on infertility shame. I won't rehash what those episodes were about, but if you haven't listened to them, make sure you go back, because it's important to understand how both shame and society's misinformation around grief impact our infertility experience. What I do want to talk about is how we grieve. This is one question or comment that I get pretty regularly. People either ask me how to grieve, or they will tell me they're not doing it well. So again, how to grieve, go back to that episode 7, Feeling Better Now. It'll give you a step-by-step process. What I want to talk about is this idea of I'm not handling this well. So first things first, I want to set the record straight from jump. There is no right or wrong way to grieve. We have no objective measure for what good grieving or bad grieving looks like. None whatsoever. The reason that people say things like, I'm not handling this well, is because grieving is very, very, very uncomfortable, painful, excruciating. And I know I've said this a million times, but I'm going to keep saying it. In our society, we are not taught how to experience an uncomfortable emotion. There is generational programming that has been modeled for us that emotions, particularly the big uncomfortable ones like grief, sadness, anxiety, etc., are inappropriate and inconvenient, and we cannot and should not talk about them, and that if we are experiencing them, it means something has gone wrong. Now, this thinking perpetuates a lot of things. It's why our society suffers from anxiety and depression at epidemic rates, right? But it also perpetuates this belief of not handling things well. For women, or even people who ascribe to female gender norms, right? I'm trying a little bit to shift my words to be more inclusive, so bear with me. I am working on it. But these female gender norms pretty much dictate that everyone else's needs come before ours. That we have to take care of everyone, physically, emotionally, mentally, that we're responsible for how other people feel, and that we come last. No one really says these expectations out loud, right? But it is the messaging that we receive from day one. Because of that, we do not give ourselves permission to feel things. We give ourselves permission to work ourselves to death. We give ourselves permission to feel like shit all the time. We give ourselves permission for other things, but not to feel our feelings. We resist them or we avoid them. Maybe we argue with them. We sure should judge ourselves for experiencing them, and none of it serves us. So, thinking about this within the context of grief, if we spend our time resisting, avoiding, arguing with, or judging our emotions, which always creates more of that feeling, what do you think that does to our grief? You guessed it. It makes it a shit ton worse. This is what makes grief feel unbearable. This is what makes people turn to alcohol, drugs, food, sex, social media, shopping, whatever it is that will give them a sense of control or pleasure or numbing. It's not the grief itself, right? The grief itself is painful, but it's this added layer of bullshit that is thrown on top of our grief. It's what we make our grief mean about ourselves that makes grieving that much more difficult, that much more excruciating. So going back to the title of the episode, Grieving Losses, there's a couple of things that I want to highlight. Number one, I talk about this in the Myths of Grief episode, but I think it bears repeating. There are some general stages that we all experience with grief, but I don't even like to use the word stages because that implies that they are supposed to happen in a certain order or that they're supposed to experience all of them. And neither of those is true. It's not a sequential thing. It's more like typical phases or experiences that people have, like denial, bargaining, anger, shock, things like that. People grieving experience those things, but it's in a very individualized way. I think my biggest beef with people that consider the stages of grieving is that last one, is acceptance. Many people make that mean that at some point you're healed. Hallelujah. You don't have any more grief. Like there's an end point to grieving, and there's not. So I'm going to share with you a quick and amazing analogy that was first shared on Twitter by a woman named Lauren Herschel. Those of us in the mental health/helping fields went crazy go nuts over this because it is so beautifully true. And it's called the ball in the box. So the idea is that grief strikes each person in a different way. That when we lose someone or something that we love, that loss hits us hard all at once. It might be lying in wait until a few weeks or months passes, but it's going to hit. So one of the things that's most difficult for people to understand is that grief and loss never really leaves us. The loss stays with us forever, but it changes over time. It usually starts out as this huge and overwhelming thing that becomes smaller over time. So here's the ball in the box. Imagine your life is a box, and the grief you feel is a ball inside of the box. Also inside of the box is a pain button. In the beginning, when the loss is so fresh and new, the grief that many people feel is overwhelming and large. It's so large, in fact, that every time you move the box, moving through your everyday life, the grief ball can hit the pain button. The ball rattles around at random, hitting the pain button every freaking time. This is how most people experience loss. You can't control it, and you can't stop it. The pain just keeps coming pretty regularly, no matter how much you try, no matter what you do, or no matter how many other people try to comfort you. The pain a person experiences may feel unrelenting and never ending, but over time, the ball starts to shrink on its own. You go through life and the ball still rattles around inside of you, right? It's not going anywhere, but because the ball has gotten smaller, it hits the pain button less often. You almost feel like you can go through days without even having the pain button hit. When it does hit, and it can be completely random and unexpected, like when you're staring at that person's name, or when you think about your embryo, or when you are folding onesies, or when you're walking through Target and you see the baby section, right? It can be anything. The pain button still delivers the same amount of pain, no matter how large or how small the ball is. But again, as time passes, the ball continues to shrink, and with it, our grief for the lost experience. Most people never forget the loss they experience, but over time, the ball becomes so small that it rarely hits the pain button. When it does, it's still as painful and hard to understand as it is the very first time we feel it. But the frequency of the hits has decreased significantly. This gives a person more time in between each hit, time used to recover and to feel quote unquote normal again. Time allows our hearts to heal and to begin to remember the person that they were in life. It's not that time is the thing that happens, right? Time isn't the thing that heals, but as you utilize more coping skills and you process your grief, that is what causes the ball to start shrinking, not time. remember, grief is never experienced the same way by any two people. But it just helps to know that grief impacts us in a way where the pain is intense at the beginning, but the frequency and sometimes the intensity of the pain lessens over time. So that is the ball in the box, and it's one of my favorite things to teach my clients. So the other thing that I want you to remember is, again, I will say this over and over and over until I'm blue in the face, there is no wrong way to grieve. All that I want you to do is allow yourself the space and the opportunity for you to grieve. This goes back to the resistance and the avoidance. Grief will always wait for you. This is true for either the situational, perceived, actual, all of it. Even though we have different classifications for our loss, our bodies and our brains don't differentiate between them. Your brain isn't like, oh, well, this is just a perceived loss, or this is just a maturation loss. It doesn't work that way. If you've experienced grief, then you've experienced grief. So let yourself experience grief. For a lot of us, just thinking about feeling grief, we think that if we allow ourselves to feel it, then we're just going to fall into this hole and we're never going to be able to get out. But it's not true. We do climb out. We do get better. Remember the ball in the box. Our grief will change, but it doesn't really go away, and that's okay. I love this quote, and I don't remember who first said it, but that grief is just love with nowhere to go. So think about that in terms of your loss. You love that baby, that picture in your head of what your family would look like. That's love. That's why we grieve. For me, I don't know that I ever want to not grieve the loss of our embryo. That was already a fully formed little person in my mind. He was already walking and talking and playing with his big brothers in my dreams. I will forever love and hold that love in my heart. I will forever love and hold that love and grief in my heart. It's precious to me. I want you to consider that with your grief, that it's this beautiful expression of love. Not that it's just this terrible and painful thing that you've experienced. It was both of those things, but it's also love. And there is nothing more beautiful than that. Okay, my friends, that is what I have for you today. I will talk to you next week. And remember, I adore you and you have got this.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard and want to learn more, head over to ivfthiscoaching.com. That's www.ivfthiscoaching.com.